It's strange to look back now and realize just how far I've come from where I was. The man I used to be, Jacob, wasn't always this broken, wasn't always the stranger in my own house. But it's not about him. Not entirely. It's about me. This is my story, but it's one that involves a lot of mistakes, decisions I wish I could take back, and a betrayal that started as something small and innocent enough, but ended up being anything but that. This is a look back on the events that led to the unraveling of everything I thought I knew. I'm 34, been married to Lydia for over 5 years now. On paper, everything looked perfect. We had the house, the friends, the jobs, everything. But somehow, it never felt like enough. We'd gotten stuck in this routine, a routine that, I now see, drained the life out of us both. I'd get home after long hours at the law firm, often too tired to even eat, and Lydia would be there, sitting in her usual spot by the window, looking out like she was waiting for something to happen, something that never did. I used to think she was just daydreaming about a life she didn't have. I guess I didn't see the emptiness in her eyes for what it truly was, loneliness. "Lydia," I'd say, as I'd walk in and place my briefcase on the counter, "how was your day?" She'd always answer with that same, rehearsed smile. "Fine, same as always." "You?" I'd mumble something about the grind, and that was it. We'd talk about the logistics of our day, the things that didn't matter. The kind of conversation that was almost an obligation. Every night was like this. Routine, routine, routine. No excitement, no spark, no real affection. One day, Lydia came downstairs in a new dress. It wasn't anything too flashy, but she had that look on her face, the kind of look that said, "I hope you notice." She stood in front of me, waiting, but I was too busy with something on my laptop. I barely looked up. "You look great, as always," I said, my words almost automatic as I continued typing. I saw the change in her face, but I didn't know what it meant at the time. I didn't realize that in that moment, I broke something in her. She turned, walked away, and I didn't give it a second thought. That's when the emptiness started to settle in. And I think that's when Lydia realized I wasn't the man I once was. And worse, I think she knew that I wasn't ever going to be that man again. A week later, Lydia decided to take a walk. She'd started walking a lot lately. I didn't think much of it, as I was working late again. Same old grind. But I was so caught up in my own world that I didn't even notice she was gone for hours. I didn't ask her where she was going, and she didn't offer any explanations. That's how it had become between us. Anyway, that day, Lydia ran into Thomas. He was the new guy who had moved in next door. I didn't know him very well. He was younger than me, around 28, and worked in some creative field. Lydia and Thomas had that one thing in common. They weren't bogged down by the day-to-day responsibilities that weighed me down. She told me later that they had started talking about literature, art, topics I used to discuss with her. I used to be her sounding board for things like that, but I wasn't anymore. The conversation seemed to flow easily between them, and Lydia found herself feeling something she hadn't felt in a long time. Like someone was actually listening to her. I didn't know it then, but that's when things started to shift. That's when the first cracks appeared. A week later, Thomas saw Lydia struggling with the fence outside. It had been broken for a while, and I hadn't gotten around to fixing it. I was too busy, as always. But Thomas, he offered to help. Lydia said she was fine, but he insisted, and she didn't argue. I can still picture it, Thomas standing there, fixing the fence with his sleeves rolled up, focusing on each nail with a kind of precision that made her smile. She told me later how he'd made eye contact with her, how he really listened when she talked. And for the first time in months, Lydia didn't feel invisible. That's when things began to change between them. That's when the emotional attachment started to form. Lydia started spending more time with him. She didn't tell me. It wasn't like that. She just started talking about him more, casually, as if he were just a friend. But I could hear it in her voice, the way she said his name, the way she looked away for just a second too long when I asked about him. And it ate at me, though I tried to ignore it. Then, there was the cafe. Lydia and Thomas met there once, just the two of them. I didn't think much of it. She'd been telling me about her usual days, the walks in the park, and then she casually mentioned Thomas in passing, like it was nothing. But when she came home that day, there was something different in her eyes. I didn't know it at the time, But it was the look of someone who had confided too much in another person. It was the look of someone who was becoming attached in ways that weren't meant for a friendship. You know, Thomas said to her that day, as they sat in the cafe, maybe you need to start thinking about yourself, not just about others. I didn't know what that meant then, but I know now. He was planting seeds. He was getting under her skin, and she was letting him. I should have noticed. I should have been there, asking the right questions, paying attention, but I wasn't. I was too wrapped up in my own life. And by the time I realized something was wrong, it was already too late. And then came the first betrayal. I was working late again, shocker, and Lydia invited Thomas over for dinner. I didn't think much of it at the time. After all, he was a neighbor, just a guy helping her with the fence. Nothing to worry about, right? I don't know what happened that night. Lydia and Thomas had dinner, and they drank some wine, as I'm sure they do. Lydia came home late, her movements more sluggish than usual, and there was something in her that didn't sit right with me. I could see it in the way she walked into the room, avoiding my gaze. What happened? I asked. She just shrugged, a vague look in her eyes. Nothing. I'm fine. But I knew. Something was different. I couldn't pinpoint it at first, but it was there. Later that night, I found out. Lydia kissed him. She kissed Thomas. She told me herself, with a mix of guilt and relief, as if confessing something that she knew had already happened before she said it aloud. It was the first kiss, and yet it was already too late. I didn't know what to say. I didn't know what to feel. Part of me wanted to scream, to curse, but I just sat there, frozen. For the first time in a long time, I was the one who didn't know how to fix it. But here's the kicker. I wasn't angry at first. I wasn't. I didn't feel that typical betrayal that people talk about when they're cheated on. No. I just felt empty. I don't think I ever fully understood what it meant to be manipulated. Not until everything had already fallen apart. I used to believe I was the one in control of my life, of my marriage, of my career. I thought I was calling the shots. But, looking back now, I can see how naive I was. Lydia was a master of it, and I didn't even realize it until I was already deep into it. I had never been one for confrontation. It wasn't my style. So when I found out about Lydia's affair with Thomas, I didn't immediately burst into anger or accusations. I should have. Maybe I could have saved us both from this mess. But instead, I chose a different path. A quieter path. I found out through her phone. It was one of those moments when things just fall into your lap without you ever intending for them to. I was working from home one afternoon, distracted by emails, and Lydia left her phone on the kitchen counter. I was walking by when I noticed it. I didn't intend to look, but the message preview caught my eye. I can't stop thinking about you. It read, from Thomas. I wasn't ready for it. I don't think anyone could be prepared for that kind of revelation. My heart skipped a beat, and then another, as I unlocked her phone. I scrolled through their messages, each one more personal, more intimate than the last. I feel seen when I'm with you, Lydia wrote in one. You make me feel like I matter. And Thomas responded with something I'll never forget. You do matter. I've never felt this way before. I stared at the screen for a long time. A part of me wanted to smash the phone, to confront her right then and there, but something inside me stopped me. I wasn't ready to fall into the trap of anger. Not yet. I wasn't going to give her the satisfaction of seeing me lose control. Instead, I did what I do best. I analyzed. I realized this wasn't just a physical affair. This wasn't just about sex or cheating. This was emotional. And that's what hurt the most. But I didn't tell her I knew. Not immediately. Instead, I decided to take control in my own way. If she could betray me emotionally, then maybe it was time for me to do the same. It wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about some childish notion of getting back at her. It was about showing her that I could feel what she felt. I was going to make her understand, and I was going to do it on my terms. That's when Eliza entered the picture. She was a colleague of mine, young, ambitious, and eager to make her mark in the firm. She was 26, and she had always been friendly toward me. But lately, there was something different about her. She started asking me more personal questions, probing into my life with an intensity that caught me off guard. It wasn't that I wasn't attracted to her. I was. But at the time, I wasn't looking for anything physical. No, Eliza became a tool. a way for me to counterbalance the betrayal Lydia had brought into our lives. I wasn't interested in love or pleasure, not at first. It was a strategy. I wanted to make Lydia see that betrayal doesn't just happen in bed. It happens in the heart, too. I started spending more time with Eliza, talking more, discussing work, but also talking about life. I think she realized something was off. She could see that I was distant, that my mind was elsewhere. And one day, after a few too many drinks, she made the first move. She kissed me. I didn't resist, not at first. I let it happen, but I wasn't there. Not emotionally. I didn't tell Lydia right away, and I don't even know why I thought I should hide it from her. I guess I was waiting for the right moment, the right time to let her know that if she wanted to play this game, so could I. Then came the day Lydia found out. It wasn't from me. Of course not. She heard it from some mutual friends, people who had seen Eliza and me leaving the office late one evening. Word spreads quickly, especially when you work in a small firm like ours. Lydia heard the whispers, and when she confronted me about it, I didn't give her the satisfaction of an emotional outburst. "What's going on, Jacob?" she asked, her voice wavering between anger and hurt. I looked her dead in the eye and said, "You chose this path, Lydia. Don't act surprised." Her face paled. For a moment, I saw a flicker of confusion, a flash of guilt, but she quickly masked it with a defensive attitude. You're just doing this because of Thomas, aren't you?" "No," I said coldly. "I'm doing this because you made me feel like I don't matter anymore." It was then that I saw it. The pain in her eyes, the realization that I wasn't just angry. I wasn't just responding out of spite. No, this was different. This was something deeper. She didn't know how to react. She wanted to justify herself, to say it was my fault, that it was my emotional neglect that pushed her into Thomas's arms. But I didn't listen. I refused to listen. And then came the first emotional breakdown. Lydia tried to hold it together, but I could see her unraveling. She was losing control, and it was because of her own actions. I could see the desperation in her eyes as she tried to explain herself. I didn't mean for it to happen like this," she said, her voice shaking. "I was lonely, Jacob. You didn't see me. You didn't care." I remained silent. I wasn't going to let her guilt trip me into feeling sorry for her. I wasn't going to feel like I had any part in her mess. I had my own problems to deal with now, and Lydia was no longer the priority. "I don't care," I said flatly. "You made your choices." It was cruel, but it was the truth. I couldn't save her anymore, and I couldn't save myself either. The damage was done, and neither of us knew how to fix it. She started to cry. Real tears this time. Tears of frustration, of helplessness. I almost felt sorry for her. But then I reminded myself, this was all part of the plan. This was what manipulation felt like. And I had only just begun. It's strange how things can spiral out of control. How you can go from being the one in power to feeling completely powerless, all without realizing when or how it happened. The truth is, Lydia and I had both lost ourselves in this mess. We were both playing a game. She was playing her game, and I was playing mine. Neither of us were innocent. But this time, I wasn't going to let her dictate the rules anymore. I was going to regain control, and I was going to do it slowly, piece by piece, using the only thing that I knew would hurt her, her own emotions. The first time Lydia tried to reach out to Thomas again, it was almost pitiful to watch. She had become so desperate, like a child trying to fix something that was already broken beyond repair. She texted him, called him, tried to make herself vulnerable in a way she thought would draw him back in. "I need you," she texted. "I can't do this alone anymore. You understand me. Please, come back." But Thomas wasn't having it. He had already seen enough of her emotional mess, and he was done. When she pushed for more, he responded coldly. "I can't be your emotional crutch anymore, Lydia. You need to figure out your life, and I'm not the one who can fix it. I'm not the one who can save you." She was crushed. I knew at the moment she walked through the door, her face pale, eyes red from the tears she hadn't yet wiped away. "I tried," she said, her voice trembling. "I tried to make things right with him, but he won't talk to me anymore. He's gone. He doesn't want me." That was the moment I started to see the cracks in her armor. She was vulnerable now, more vulnerable than she had ever been with me. and I wasn't going to waste that opportunity. I had already made my move with Eliza, but now I had to take it a step further. I wasn't just going to make Lydia feel betrayed. I was going to make her feel small. I was going to break her down emotionally, piece by piece, until she was nothing but a shadow of the woman she once was. That's when Rebecca entered the picture. Rebecca was a young woman I met through work. She was in her early 20s, a bright, eager person who looked up to me, perhaps a little too much. I didn't pay much attention to her at first, but as I started executing my plan, I realized she could be a useful tool. She was easy to manipulate, young enough to be flattered by my attention, and naive enough to believe my every word. I started spending more time with her, casual meetings at the office, the occasional coffee break. Nothing too serious at first, just enough to keep Lydia on edge. I didn't know if Lydia noticed it yet, but I could see the tension in her eyes every time she saw Rebecca and me together. I made sure to appear more engaged with Rebecca than I had ever been with her, laughing at her jokes, giving her more of my attention than I ever gave Lydia. I could feel Lydia's jealousy growing. I could feel her insecurity bubbling beneath the surface. But I didn't stop. I needed her to feel it. I needed her to feel exactly what she had made me feel for all these years. The constant emotional neglect, the feeling of being invisible, of being unimportant. Then, one night, after yet another long day at work, I went to see my father. Lawrence had always been a strong figure in my life. 60 years old, former military, a man who believed in tough love and the strength of self-control. I hadn't spoken to him in a while, but I knew he would understand. I didn't want to drag him into my problems, but something about this whole situation made me feel like I was losing myself. Maybe I needed to hear someone else's perspective, someone who had gone through something similar. We sat in his study, a glass of whiskey in front of me. I could feel the weight of the situation pressing on my chest, and I knew I needed to get it out. "Dad," I said, staring at the amber liquid in my glass, "I don't know what to do anymore. Lydia's affair. It's tearing everything apart. I don't even know who I am anymore." He listened quietly, letting me speak, before he finally leaned back in his chair and took a long sip from his own glass. "I went through something like that once," he said, his voice steady and calm. "When you were younger, your mother did something similar to me. It was years ago, but it still stings. Betrayal's never easy, son. But you've got to remember one thing. Don't let her make you lose control. Don't let her take your dignity." I didn't know what to say. My father had always been the strong, silent type, the man who kept everything under control. But now, hearing him admit to his own vulnerability, I felt something change in me. Maybe I wasn't as weak as I thought I was. Maybe I didn't have to crumble under the pressure of Lydia's actions. "You have to make sure she sees that what she's doing isn't just hurting you," he continued. "It's hurting her too. And if she's going to break things down, you make sure you stay strong. Be the man you are. Don't let her take everything from you." His words stuck with me, and for the first time in weeks, I felt like I could breathe again. I wasn't going to let Lydia win. I wasn't going to let her tear me apart, not without a fight. But Lydia was still spiraling. She wasn't just dealing with the consequences of her own actions anymore. She was also dealing with the emotional toll of my indifference. I could see the toll it was taking on her. Lydia wasn't just lost in her relationship with Thomas anymore. She was lost in her own mind, her own sense of self. She had reached out to Thomas, but now she was reaching out to anyone who would listen. Her sister Sarah called her often, trying to support her, trying to comfort her. But Sarah didn't understand. She didn't know the full story. She didn't know the depths of Lydia's betrayal. All she knew was that Lydia was hurting, and she wanted to fix it. I overheard a conversation between Lydia and Sarah one evening, and I could hear the desperation in Lydia's voice as she tried to explain herself. "I never meant for it to go this far," Lydia said, her voice cracking. "I never wanted to hurt Jacob, but I didn't know how else to deal with everything. He wasn't there for me, Sarah. He was never there. And Thomas, he was the only one who ever really listened." But I could hear the doubt in her voice, the realization that she couldn't justify her actions anymore. Lydia was unraveling. She was lost, and the emptiness inside her was only growing. And I had only just begun to take control. The thing about revenge, or at least, the kind of revenge I was pursuing, is that it doesn't always look like what people expect it to. It's not explosive, it's not loud, and it doesn't involve acts of public confrontation. No, my revenge was subtle, quiet, and deadly. It was a slow burn, a steady erosion of everything Lydia had once known and relied on. And as she spiraled deeper into her own guilt and confusion, I could feel the distance between us growing wider. It was exactly what I wanted. Lydia's attempt to salvage what was left of our marriage was both predictable and painful. I had seen it coming from a mile away. She called me multiple times in the days following her discovery of my affair with Eliza. Her voice was filled with desperation, each apology more frantic than the last. "Jacob, please. We can fix this. I'm sorry for everything. Please, just talk to me." But I didn't answer. I couldn't bring myself to care anymore. Not about her. Not about the years we spent together. When I finally did respond, it was cold and final. "I don't need your excuses, Lydia. We're beyond that now." I let my words hang in the air between us, devoid of any warmth or compassion. Lydia's pleas, her apologies, they meant nothing to me. And that was the point. She had hurt me, and now it was my turn. But what I was doing wasn't about pain. It was about control. It was about making her see how small she had made me feel for all those years. I wanted her to understand that I no longer cared. Her reaction to my indifference was exactly what I expected. She fell deeper into the emotional abyss. The more I ignored her, the more she tried to reconnect, and the further I pushed her away. It was the perfect strategy. I wasn't interested in rekindling anything with Lydia. No, I had moved on. I began spending more time with Rebecca, more than I ever had before. She was a convenient distraction, a temporary emotional confidant who offered me validation and a sense of control. I had no real attachment to her. She was a tool in my plan, and she played her part perfectly. It wasn't that Rebecca didn't know what she was getting into. She did. She had to. I was blunt with her about where I stood emotionally, but she was young, and she was eager for any attention I gave her. I could feel Lydia's jealousy from across the room every time she saw us together. It didn't matter. I didn't need Lydia's approval anymore. With Rebecca on the periphery, I turned my attention to my career. It had always been my safety net, but now it became my everything. My ambition was sharper than ever, and I focused on securing a promotion that had always seemed just out of reach. I threw myself into work, meeting with clients, building connections, and driving forward in a way I never had before. The more I immersed myself in my success, the less I thought about Lydia, and the more I started to feel like the man I was before everything had fallen apart. And in doing so, I began to see just how much power I had gained. I had regained control of my life. My focus on success became my anchor, the thing that grounded me in this new version of myself, stronger, more independent, and far removed from the person I had been in the marriage I once believed in. But Lydia? She was losing everything. Thomas became increasingly distant from her. I wasn't there to see it firsthand, but I could imagine the calls, the texts she sent, the questions she asked, all going unanswered. His detachment mirrored mine, and I could feel Lydia's frustration building. She didn't understand why both of us, two men she had turned to for validation and attention, were now rejecting her. Her emotional spiral only deepened as she realized that Thomas was gone for good, just like I had become. She reached out to her friends, tried to make them understand, but no one could fill the hole that had been left. They were too busy with their own lives, and most of them didn't even know the full extent of her betrayal. To them, Lydia was still the vibrant woman they had known, the one who had always been the life of the party. But behind closed doors, she was broken, and no one was there to pick up the pieces. It was Sarah, Lydia's sister, who began to take notice of the change. At first, she tried to offer support, but she didn't understand. She couldn't understand. "Lydia, you need help. You need to talk to someone, maybe even therapy," Sarah suggested one evening, her voice filled with concern. "You can't keep doing this to yourself. Maybe it's time to make amends with Jacob. It's not too late." Lydia's face fell. She wanted to believe Sarah's words. She wanted to fix things, to patch up the mess she had created. But deep down, she knew it was already too late. There was no going back. And it wasn't just Jacob's coldness she had to face. It was her own reflection, the realization that she had destroyed the only thing that had ever mattered. "I can't face him, Sarah," Lydia said quietly. "I can't face the person I've become, and I can't fix this. I don't know how. I didn't know how to fix it either. But that wasn't my problem anymore." Lydia tried. I could see it in her eyes. But each time she reached out, each time she attempted to bring me back into her world, I pushed her further away. Her isolation grew more pronounced, and with it, her emotional turmoil. Finally, Lydia asked me, one last time, if there was any chance for reconciliation. She reached out with a final plea, her voice soft and broken. She couldn't let go of the hope that we could somehow repair what had been shattered. I couldn't help but feel a cold satisfaction when I read her message. "You had your chance," I replied. "I've moved on." I meant it. I had moved on, not just from her, but from the person I had been. From the man who once cared too much, the man who had let his emotions control him. That man was gone now. I was something else, something stronger, something free. For Lydia, the rejection was devastating. She had lost me. She had lost everything. And it wasn't just the loss of a husband. It was the realization that her actions had consequences she wasn't prepared to face. Days turned into weeks, and Lydia's situation only worsened. Her life, which had once been filled with possibilities, now felt like a prison. One evening, she stood in front of the mirror, tears streaming down her face. She looked at herself, seeing the full extent of what she had become. A woman who had destroyed her marriage, betrayed the man who had loved her, and lost everything in the process. The weight of her mistakes crushed her, and she couldn't take it anymore. The tears came in waves, uncontrollable, as she finally confronted the reality of her actions. Alone, and I, for the first time in months, felt no sympathy, only a distant satisfaction, knowing that I had one. The transformation was complete. It's funny, looking back on everything that's happened. I never imagined this is where I'd be. I thought I had control, that I could hold everything together. But in the end, the truth was unavoidable. Lydia and I were two people drifting farther and farther apart, each of us making choices that would eventually lead to this final moment. The moment when everything I had worked for, everything I had strived to regain, was finally mine. When I realized that I had won, not because I wanted to make Lydia suffer, but because I had finally taken control of my own life. My transformation was complete. I had fully detached from Lydia in every way that mattered, emotionally, psychologically, and physically. It wasn't easy, not at first, but with every passing day, the distance between us grew. My career was flourishing, my social life was vibrant, and most importantly, I had regained my independence. For the first time in years, I felt free. The weight of our past, of her betrayal, had lifted, and I was moving forward. And then, months after the final rupture, Lydia tried to reach out again. I wasn't surprised when I saw her standing there, waiting for me outside a cafe one afternoon. She looked different, hollow, tired. Her once confident demeanor now replaced with something I couldn't quite place. Regret, maybe. Guilt. Whatever it was, it didn't matter anymore. I had moved on, and I wasn't going to let her drag me back into a conversation that was long past its time. When she tried to speak, her voice was softer than I expected, filled with hesitation. "Jacob, I need closure. I need to understand everything that happened." I looked at her, really looked at her, for the first time in months. She had changed, but I hadn't. I was still the same person who had been betrayed, who had suffered the consequences of her choices. I had rebuilt myself, but Lydia, she was still stuck, still bound to the guilt and confusion that had led her to this point. "You want closure?" I said, my voice steady and calm. "I don't need you to apologize, Lydia. You made your choice, and so did I. I'm at peace with what happened." There was no anger in my words, no malice. I wasn't being cruel. I was simply stating the truth. Her attempts to rekindle what we once had, her need to make sense of our past, didn't faze me. It wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about accepting what had happened and moving forward. "I've moved on," I added, and this time, there was finality in my tone. It wasn't just the end of our marriage. It was the end of my emotional attachment to her. The weight of her actions, the pain I had felt, no longer had a hold over me. I was free. And Lydia? She was left with the harsh truth of her choices. Her face faltered for a moment, her eyes searching mine for something, anything that might show a flicker of the man she had once known. But I didn't give her that. I didn't let her in anymore. She had lost that privilege. She left, defeated, and I watched her walk away. For a brief moment, I felt a pang of something I couldn't quite name. Maybe it was pity. Maybe it was just the understanding that she, too, had lost something precious. But then I remembered. She had made her choices, and I had made mine. Lydia's journey from here on out would be her own. She had to rebuild, to face the consequences of her actions. She started therapy. I knew that much. But the truth was, there was no quick fix for the damage she had done to herself. She had betrayed me, yes, but more importantly, she had betrayed herself. She had lost her sense of identity, her sense of worth, in a quest for something she thought would fill the emptiness inside her. And now she had to live with that. In her attempts to heal, she began to reclaim her independence, but it was a slow, painful process. The emotional scars from her affair with Thomas and the failure of our marriage lingered, haunting her every step. She knew that her life could never return to what it once was, but what she didn't know was how to move forward. The guilt was too heavy, and the loss too great. Meanwhile, I was thriving. The man I had become was stronger, more confident, more in control than I had ever been. My career was booming, and I had the freedom to shape my future without Lydia's influence. I wasn't just surviving. I was living in a way I hadn't in years. And then, one day, as I stood at the top of my game, I realized that I had one. Not through revenge, not through manipulation, but through something much more powerful: emotional resilience and independence. I had turned my pain into something positive. I had used the hurt to fuel my growth, and now I was unshackled from the past, free to write the next chapter of my life. Lydia, on the other hand, was left behind in the ruins of her own making. I didn't need to see her struggle to know that she would. I knew that her path to redemption, if it even existed, would be long and uncertain. The road ahead for her was full of self-discovery, but it would be one that she would have to walk alone. In the quiet of my new life, I finally understood the full weight of everything that had happened. The betrayal, the heartbreak, the emotional turmoil. It had all been necessary. It had been the catalyst for my transformation. And in the end, I wasn't just a survivor. I was a victor. As Lydia's shadow faded from my life, I stood taller, knowing that I had emerged from the darkness into something far brighter. I had won. I had taken control of my fate, unshackled by the past, and finally free to be the man I had always been meant to be. Lydia, in the quiet of her own reflection, would come to understand the depth of her mistakes. But by then, I would be long gone, a distant memory, and I would never look back. The final victory was mine.